Things are really heating up between the US and Iran, right? You've probably seen it in the news. Huge protests, a really violent crackdown from the government, and now the United States is issuing these very serious warnings. It's one of those moments where you feel like every word, every move could change everything.
And then you hear this phrase pop up. All options are on the table. We're hearing it a lot from U.S. officials, even at the UN Security Council. And if you follow this stuff, you know this is a classic line. It's meant to be vague, a little scary, right? It's all about projecting strength and making sure your opponent doesn't know exactly what you're going to do next. But let's be real, what does that actually mean? All options. It sounds big, but what's in the playbook? That's what we're going to break down right here. We're going to get past the jargon and map out what the U.S. is realistically looking at, from hitting them in the wallet all the way up to potential military action.
Okay, so before we jump into what could happen, we've got to understand what's already happening. Because the US isn't just sitting around waiting. There's a strategy, a playbook, that's already in motion right now.
And that strategy really has three main parts. First, you've got international pressure, trying to build a coalition at places like the UN. Second, and this is a big one, economic sanctions. This is the Treasury Department's job, through an office called OFAC. And we're seeing this play out right now. They're targeting specific people involved in the protest crackdowns, and even going after this so-called shadow fleet of Iranian oil tankers. And finally, the third piece is classic military deterrence. Basically, moving big assets, think aircraft carriers, into the neighborhood to send a very, very clear signal.
So, with that as our starting point, now we can really dig in. We're going to break down the potential US actions into 3 different levels or tiers based on how intense they are. Think of this as the real map behind that phrase, all options are on the table.
All right, let's start with Tier 1. This is the low-intensity stuff. We're talking non-military actions here. The whole point isn't to start a fight, it's to apply pressure in a structured way, to make it more and more expensive for the Iranian regime to do what it's doing, and to mess with their operations, all without a single shot being fired.
And don't let low intensity fool you. These tools are incredibly powerful. Things like expanding sanctions on specific people or disrupting financial networks, those have a very high chance of happening. You could say this is the current sweet spot for Washington. And why is that? Well, because when you go after something like Iran's shadow banking system, these secret ways they move money around to get past sanctions, you can have a huge impact. You're literally choking off their cash.
Now, let's ramp it up a bit to Tier 2. This is where things get more serious. The military starts to get involved, and this is a key distinction, it's in a defensive role. The goal is deterrence. It's about making Iran think twice and preventing things from escalating, not about kicking off a war. So this tier is all about taking a protective stance. And we're already seeing some of this stuff happen, right? More military assets being moved into place, beefing up protection for U.S. personnel. And this tension has real-world consequences you can see. It's why they're working to secure shipping routes and why you see warnings go out to civilians, causing airlines and cargo ships to literally change their course to stay out of harm's way. And that brings us to the top, Tier 3. This is direct military action. This is the last resort category that gets all the headlines. But you have to understand the cost, both politically and militarily, is just enormous. So that completely changes the game when you talk about whether and when these options would actually be used. Okay, look closely here, because the most important word you're going to see is conditional. See that likelihood column? This stuff isn't on some kind of automatic timeline. It's not an escalator just going up. A limited strike to hit back after an attack is, well, it's conditional on that attack actually happening. Same thing for strikes on nuclear facilities. These options are definitely on the table, but whether they get used depends completely on what Iran does first. And that idea of conditionality is so important. So let's shift gears a little bit. We've looked at the menu of options, right? Now let's talk about the decision-making. What are the actual events, the triggers, that would make the U.S. seriously consider moving up from one tier to the next?
So here's probably the most straightforward trigger, an attack on U.S. or allied forces that results in American casualties. If that happens, a response is almost guaranteed. You'd see immediate moves to protect forces, and then there's a very, very high chance of a limited tit-for-tat strike. The goal there is what they call restoring deterrence credibility, which is just a fancy way of saying you have to prove your warnings aren't just talk. Okay, what about this scenario? Iran tries to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, that's a massive choke point for global oil. The response here would likely have 2 parts. First, you'd see the military move in to physically reopen and secure those shipping lanes. But at the exact same time,
You'd see the U.S. massively ramp up financial sanctions to really hammer the people responsible for the blockade. What if the trigger isn't something Iran does outside its borders, but inside? Say, the human rights situation gets much, much worse. In that case, the main U.S. response would be to go right back to that Tier 1 playbook. The first move would be to roll out bigger packages of sanctions, targeting the specific individuals responsible, basically doubling down on the policy they're already using. And finally, the big one, the nuclear program. If Iran continues to block international inspectors and that deadlock goes on, the playbook says more pressure. That means going to the UN, adding more sanctions. The military option, strikes on nuclear sites, would absolutely stay on the table. But it would be used mainly as a credible threat, something to give the diplomats and the sanctions more teeth, not something they do right away. So there you have it. We've laid out the options, we've looked at the triggers. Now let's pull it all together and try to answer the big question. What is the U.S. most likely to do next, like in the very near future? And I mean very near future. We're not guessing about what happens months down the road. This forecast is all about the next 1 to 2 weeks. What's the immediate outlook? All right, so the analysis points to 2 things as most likely. First, expect more sanctions. They'll probably keep expanding them to hit more human rights violators and those financial networks we talked about that prop up the regime. Second, expect to see the military deployments and force protection continue. These are moves to deter any aggression. And why these 2? It's pretty simple, actually. It's just the next logical step in the strategy they're already running. And really, this brings us back to the most important thing to remember from all this. You're going to hear a lot of tough talk, a lot of rhetoric about all options, but those direct military strikes, that Tier 3 stuff, they remain conditional. They're not the default next step. For that to happen, a very specific trigger has to be pulled. The talk is loud for sure, but the action needs a tripwire. So in the end, the playbook is pretty much set. The triggers, those red lines that could lead to a real escalation, are known. You could say all the pieces are on the chessboard. The only real question left is, what happens next?